Gregnar stood above her little brother, been admonishing him for over 20 minutes as she screamed down at him, "How could you possibly let humans beat you? Don't you know how small and frail and squishy those pathetic little bipeds are?" This seemed to be odd, considering Gretnar was of a biped species. The Forsh had been the seemingly strongest species out in the entire galaxy for decades now. And yet, now that a new species had joined into the ranks of the Galactic Union itself, a species known as human, she tried to figure out why the humans were showing up, even her little brother. She did not have any of these humans in her class as she was about to graduate herself, but now there were some in her little brother's class, and they were showing him up. Not only had the humans seemed to be extremely smart, showing extreme high amounts of engineering abilities and skills, but seemingly they were able to beat the Forged in all their athletic abilities. This was apparent as Gretnar's young brother had failed to play a simple game against the humans. This was their version of hide and seek. However, it was played with a type of simunition. If you went out there and searched for each other and you had to use your own natural abilities, no electronics were to be used, but you simply had this one weapon with approximately 10 shots. Now, they could not be fired in succession, and they worked very similar to a bolt-action rifle. The humans seemed to understand this weapon almost instinctively as soon as they got it. In fact, there was a clear video of when they were shown the first one, and the humans simply reached up, opened the bolt back, and looked in, and they asked, "What are you doing?" "I'm making sure it's clear." And when he closed it and handed it back to the instructor was moving their arms around, and when the muzzle of this, well, simple toy, truly, had swung towards the human, he had simply grabbed it, twisted it, slammed it down, and simply said, "Don't flag your weapon on me." The translation was kind of strange. "Do not put banner on my face?" What? The translations were off, as the human languages were very vast, and what is known to the humans as slang did not translate well. However, during this time, Gretnar's brother had been considered the very best. His senses were far beyond anything anyone else had. His binocular vision was similar to that of humans, but he could seemingly reach out farther. His sense of smell was believed to be much stronger, along with his sense of taste. Along with that, the Forced tend to travel on 4 legs, which allowed them to understand the ground much better. Along with that, they believed that they had a particular sense that they could figure out what was going on, who was looking in their direction. And this is what made them so impressive to watch. And yet, there was only one human out there. Gretnar's brother was leading a pack of 4 of the Forced, and they were all taken down. They didn't even know where the shots came from. Her brother screamed in pain. He was the first one taken down as he was shot in his hindquarters right next to his tail and stumbled to the ground. The others didn't have a chance to understand what was going on as he reached towards his backside and said, "I've been hit, I've been hit, I've been hit." And yet, with the video showing that he was doing everything right, he still lost. And eventually, they asked for the human to show himself, but the human did not show up. They ended the games a little bit, and as everyone headed back to the starting area, they saw the human simply standing there with a strange sort of cloth hanging off of a pack. They asked what it was, and he simply laughed. But because of this, because he laughed, that was considered the biggest of insults to the Forced. Gretnar was so mad that she actually proclaimed to her brother, "I'm going to take down this human myself." Her brother reached at her, begging for her. No, no, sister, do not. You do not know what you are facing. Hands off! And she backhanded him across the head with that gigantic paw of hers. This was a sign of true dominance in her species. Her brother held his head low again and seemingly almost cried at the thought of her being taken down by the humans. The match was set for the next day, and there would only be a few combatives. There would be Gretnar and 2 of her best hunters against the one human. The one human insisted, even though other humans said they can go with him. But the human simply raised its hand up, open palm forward, and seemingly grinned, and then said, I have this. Everyone was confused as they were trying to wait until the translator finished the sentence, because I have something was not translating. They switched it to the exact words. He said, I got this. What does he got? What? They shook it off and eventually went to their starting positions, and then the buzzer sounded. With that, they began to move forward, stalking, sniffing the air, reaching around, trying to find where it might be. They looked into a clearing and believed it would be a very bad idea to cross the clearing themselves. So they went around the far side. They just barely were in view when they heard. With that, Garikna's partner grabbed his hindquarter, grabbed the back end right next to his tail, and once again screamed, It hit me! It hit me! Ah! He got me! I'm out! I'm out! Gariknar ran back and looked, and sure enough, there was a solid welt on the hindquarter. She looked around, but she couldn't see anything. She kept low, sniffed the air, and looked around for anything, any movement that there might be there. She now only had one person to help, one of her associates, called Ren. Gren was a fine hunter, a female like her, and they realized that they could possibly use this to their advantage. But then she turned and sniffed the air and cursed at Gren that she was in season, and it must be what gave them away. The humans must have a good sense of smell, and they were able to actually smell her as she was entering her mating cycle. Gren simply said, No, it's too early, it's too early. There's no way that they could smell that. How could they know? As they fought, they heard, and Garen went down screaming as right underneath her tail had been struck, and she immediately dropped to the ground, shoving her butt to the ground, screaming, it got me. With that, she couldn't realize what the heck was going on. Gariknar looked around again. She didn't realize 2 of her associates had already been down. The first one had already held up the red flag and started to walk out. She could still see him. She realized that Gren had been hit as soon as she had stepped up to try and take point. But where was this shot coming from? They seemed to be coming from behind, but where? Where were they coming from? She looked around, and she had to skulk. She moved as low as she could through the brush. She tried not to move any of the leaves, any of the foliages as she moved along. She began to encircle everything. The entire field she walked around, slowly crawling on her belly. For hours it seemed, she pulled herself along by her claws, seemingly enough to just scrape her belly on the ground, keeping herself low enough that there was no way a shot could be taken. Even if it was, it would be deflected off of the foliage. So she continued. For hours and hours she began to crawl. What the hell? Where is this thing? I should see him. I should get movement. I could get a sniff. I know what he smells like. Where is he? Gariknar finally realized that she had completely encircled the field. Oh, son of a canine female. I guarantee he's left here. He probably abandoned as soon as he got that extra shot off, is what she thought, as she began to get up and walk across the field. And as she got about halfway, right into her hindquarter, bullseyeing right up Main Street, and Gretnar dropped down to her butt, and the buzzer sound, signifying the end of the game, as cameras had been watching the whole time. As the proud Forst fell on the ground, holding her butt, she realized that she had been shot right where the sun don't shine. And she started screaming as she thrashed on the ground in pain. "Where are you, human? I'll tear you apart. I'll find you eventually, no matter how far away you're hiding. I will find you. As she finally got a hold on the pain, she tried to stand up, but she realized that where she had been tagged had been close to the end of her spinal column. This was just enough pressure to make it difficult for her to walk. As she tried to get up, she stumbled more than once, and eventually she heard, "Need a hand?" Gregnar looked around. Where was that voice coming from? Was there a probe nearby? I'm asking nicely. Do you need a hand? Now Gregnar was starting to freak out. Where the hell was he? Where was this? He had to be close. That didn't sound like a speaker. She pulled out her translator and looked at it to see if it was receiving something else. And then she heard, at least in her own mind. She put it back in, realizing that a voice was actually coming close by. "It doesn't seem like you can walk. Can I give you a hand without you trying to claw my throat out?" Gregnar now was beginning to shake. This was not being said loud. This was but a whisper. This was someone talking normally, but where was he? She looked around left and right, spun around. Every time she tried to spin around, the pain in her ass just made it worse, and she yelped as she rolled over. "That's it. I'm going to help you out. Just do me a favor. Keep that legendary forced rage under control." To Gregnar's absolute horror, it seemed as though the center of the field began to rise up like a demon from some sort of horror story. It seemed to raise up more and more and more, and she realized it was holding one of those training rifles. She couldn't see its face. She thought for sure that the great taker of souls had come to take her down to their own version of hell itself. And then it reached up, grabbed the front, and whipped the front of it back. The human exposed its face and was smiling at her ever so slightly. It stood there in a full ghillie suit and looked down at her as she still shook in fear at this. And he simply said, "Boo."